everyone. I'm Alan Wenzel, Freepod host, and I'd like to welcome you to this extended Freepod interview, which is going to be a little different kind of an interview than we've had in the past. It's about a topic certainly that's relatable to Freeport, but it's not currently in the news, so to speak. Last month, Netflix debuted a limited drama series on the story of President James Garfield, and his assassination by Freeport native Charles Guiteau. It's entitled Death by Lightning, and this acclaimed series examines the politics of the time in the United States while comparing and contrasting Garfield and Guiteau. Joining me today to talk about this interesting story and its connection to Freeport are Sharon Welton, Executive Director of the Stephenson County Historic Museum, and Dr. Ed Finch, local historian and retired history and American Studies teacher at Freeport High School. Welcome, Sharon and Ed. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin with, that was great. You did it in unison. That's a good start to the interview. We'll see how the rest of it goes. Ed, I'd like to start with you, just kind of set the historical context for the story of Garfield and Guiteau, and tell us a little bit about what was going on in the country at the time that Garfield was elected president, and can you tell me a little bit about Garfield himself?
Garfield gets elected in November of 1880, and the United States was, particularly the political level in Washington, was still, in a sense, kind of fighting the Civil War, even though it was 15 years after the war had ended. There were, in Congress, the radical Republicans who favored really hammering the southern states, continuing to deprive them of things because they had started the war. And out of that, though, had emerged a group of more moderate Republicans to which Garfield was a member, and they were not inclined to do that. There were other issues they had in mind. In particular, the Grant administration, which had followed Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, took over after Lincoln was assassinated. The Grant administration had been really corrupt. Even though Grant wasn't, he just had to employ a whole lot of people who were. And so there was real push on the part of some people for civil service reform, because almost every job at the federal level was an appointee. And so it was a massive turnover of federal employees, postmasters, everything else. And every time there was a new administration, and a lot of people got paid for doing nothing. And so there was a real push to do that. And there was also an attempt on the part of the radical Republicans. They wanted prohibition. They wanted to ban alcohol. They were very anti-Catholic. They were anti-immigrant for the most part. And so there was this divide within the Republican Party, which was, at the time, the majority party. Garfield came out of that, and he spoke very eloquently at the Republican nominating convention in 1880 about the issues that he believed in, which included the issue of reforming the civil service system and maintaining the rights of the freedmen, that is, the former slaves that the constitutional amendments had guaranteed them. So he was pushing for that.
So he wasn't even a candidate within his own party for the presidency, but he came out of that convention as kind of a compromise candidate. When the convention deadlocked, they turned to Garfield as the man who would lead their party in the election of 1880.
Correct. At least if you believe the TV series, that it was his speech that sort of put him on everybody's radar. Mm-hmm. And as the deadlock continued over ballot after ballot after ballot, people started turning to him as a compromise candidate to lead the party in the 1880 election.
And at the time, he was a congressman from Ohio. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, he'd been in the Congress a number of years, been a major general in the Civil War. He was an attorney. He was a preacher. He had quite an extensive background, came from a family that was born in a log cabin with dirt floors and had basically...
So like the Abraham Lincoln story.
Yeah, very much like Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got this political thing going on in the country. James Garfield rises to the top of his party that will lead them in the election of 1880. So we kind of know what was going on in the country at the time. Sharon, tell me a little bit now. Let's contrast that or compare that a little bit with the Guiteau family. What do we know about the Guiteau family in Freeport during that time?
Okay, well, to tell you about the Guiteau family, we have to go back about 40 years. Luther Guiteau came here in 1838. He was one of the early settlers to Freeport. He was born in New York State, and when he got here, he opened a dry goods store. He was a pretty prominent person in early Freeport. He was postmaster from 1840 to 1844. He was the first county commissioner of schools, which is kind of like the superintendent today. He was the first police magistrate. He served one term as clerk of the circuit court, and he was on a lot of other clubs and organizations. He was one of the committee members on to build the Soldiers Monument after the Civil War. And if you've ever seen one of the certificates, his name is signed along with Smith D. Atkins. His first wife, he married Jane Howe, and they had 5 children, 3 of whom lived. Charles Guiteau was right in the middle. He was born in 1841. And after his mother gave birth to him, she became sickly and reclusive. She actually lost her next 2 children at very early ages. And it is now believed that she suffered from severe postpartum depression. And she finally died when Charles was 7.
So at that time, when Charles had a sister, then at that point?
He had an older sister and an older brother.
An older brother.
And then after he was born, his mother gave birth to 2 more children. Both died before they were 2. 5 years later, he married his second wife, Harriet Blood, and Charles was very angered by this. He was 12 years old. His father hadn't told him that he was going to remarry, and he was so angered by it that his father sent him to live with his sister, Frances, and her husband, George Scoville, in Chicago, and they're featured in the movie.
So the Netflix series, yes, it seems to suggest that there was a fairly close relationship between Charles and his sister, Frances, Franny, as he called her.
Yeah.
So that may be because he went to live with her for a while.
He lived with her for a couple of years, and he would go back and forth. I think, yes, she was always kind of there for him in some ways.
Now, what do we know about Charles's relationship with his father? It seems to me to have been kind of a stormy relationship. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. There's reports that Luther beat Charles often. Charles was hyperactive, and Luther believed to get him in control, beating him would work. There was an event that happened, and it is documented in the closing statement of the prosecution that when Charles was about 18, he got so mad at his father, he hit him in the head, and his father turned around, and it became a whole fist fight thing. And shortly after that, Charles left. And I need to say, there's a whole nother thing here. Luther Guiteau was a follower of John Humphrey Noyes. He was a religious person who in 1848 founded what was called the Oneida Colony, or the Oneida Community in New York. And this was a communal utopian society. Noyes believed that Christ had already made his second coming in like 70 AD. And now it was this group could start the Christ millennial kingdom, and they would be free from sin. And this was called perfectionism. But the one thing that made Oneida stand out from other utopian societies is that they also believed in something called complex marriage. It was essentially every man was married to every woman, and they should not be monogamous. But unlike the TV series, actually Noyes and a group of leaders would pick the couples, and they would sign an agreement, and they would enter into a short-term relationship. And so this was something that angered all the communities around that they were doing this.
So Sharon, this was Luther's, he was a follower of this Noyes guy.
Yep.
And where was Charles at this time? Was he in Freeport? When did he leave Freeport? How did he get connected to the society then that his father believed in or supported, at least?
Yes. I was going to get to that. So Noyes, and it seems like Noyes and Luther Guiteau were actually close, and that Noyes actually visited him in Freeport many times. Charles mentions that he had met him in Freeport here. And Charles's second wife refused to join the Oneida Colony. She was not going to have anything to do with that. And so Luther was always trying to impress his son Charles that he should go. The older son was already married and living in Boston. He was an attorney. And so he kind of focused on Charles, that Charles should do this.
So Charles then was convinced to go try this society?
No, not yet.
Okay.
First, when this occurred, when he was 18, where he beat his father up, the fight may have been because Charles wanted to attend school. He wanted to go to Ann Arbor, and Luther really wanted him to go to the Oneida colonies. So finally, Charles had gotten some money from his maternal grandfather when he died. Finally, Luther relented and let Charles go to Ann Arbor. Well, he got to Ann Arbor, and it was harder than he thought. He seemed to be a guy who always tried to get away on the easy side, which later would help make him sort of a con man. But he was at Ann Arbor for a short time and decided he'd just give up and go to the Oneida colonies.
Okay.
So he stayed at the Oneida colony for about 5 years throughout the Civil War. He kind of hid out there probably. And he was very disliked. The reports are that he was, I have a quote from one of the books that was written shortly after he was executed. And the quote was, "His vanity was nauseating." So,
given all of that, Ed, how did he get tied to Garfield? What was his connection to, Garfield and his politics of the time? How did all of that develop?
Well, if you want to play a little bit of armchair psychologist, I guess you could say that through most of his life, Charles was always looking for somebody to accept him.
Okay.
And he just bounced around from things like Sharon was saying, the college didn't work out for him, so he tried the Oneida colonies and that didn't work out for him. And so he was looking for something. And when he heard the speech that Garfield gave at the 1880 Republican Convention, it sort of struck a chord with him in terms of things that he thought ought to be happening, particularly the rights of the freedmen and the ending of corruption. And so he decided that at that point that he was going to become a follower of Garfield, especially after Garfield got the nomination.
So being a follower of Garfield, what did he do then? Did he campaign on his behalf?
Yes.
He did.
Yeah, you have to remember that up until modern times, it was considered actually sort of improper for somebody to campaign for the office of president. And so in following that tradition, Garfield did not campaign. It was called a front porch campaign. He sat on his front porch in Ohio and people would come visit him. Actually, the railroads built a railroad line right up to his front porch and brought trainloads of people who came to hear him speak a couple of times a day. And that was as far as he got actually campaigning. So you always had to have, if you were running for president, people all over the country who were giving speeches on your behalf, trying to get people to vote for you. And so Garfield got into that, and he wrote a speech for Garfield. And then, but the thing was just bizarre, totally disconnected. But a lot of people didn't know him, so they'd put him on programs with other speakers. And then after they heard him, it's like, oh, my God, this guy's just nuts. And incoherency and just ramble on and on. And so, but that's how he got involved. And, of course, in Guiteau's mind, by the time the campaign was over and Garfield wins this narrow victory, he was the one who made the difference.
Oh, I see.
He's the one who got Garfield elected. So Garfield owed him for that.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, we go back to the conceit that Charles always had, thinking that his vanity. Yeah. He had actually in 1869, when he would have been 28 years old, he married a 16-year-old girl in Chicago, and somehow he managed to pass the bar and became a lawyer. But he was doing these low-level jobs, like he would go out to collect money for clients, and then he would tell the clients that he couldn't get the money and he would keep the money. And it was getting worse and worse. It's kind of interesting that he and his wife were in the Chicago fire, and she says later that they lost everything. All they were able to take with them were their clothing. So in 1873, he grants her a divorce on the grounds of adultery. And he's now a full-time con man. He tried preaching. He really wanted to start a newspaper. He wanted to start, I think that was in the movie too, The Theocrat. And one of the people that he goes to for a loan is John Adams, the father of Jane Addams, back in Cedarville. He tried.
Interesting.
He knew, because of his father being a cashier at the bank, he knew John Adams and tried to get money from him, and that failed. And so I think that's when he started he loved preaching, he loved giving speeches, and so politics kind of
like being in the limelight, or he liked to be on the soapbox, giving a speech and having people pay attention to him. So he began to stump for Garfield when that election rolled around as a way for him to have the eye of the public.
Another way to preach. Yeah.
Another way to preach. So he's preaching. He's supporting Garfield. Garfield gets elected. And what turned the events then? He was a supporter of Garfield, and he liked him. He liked what he stood for, apparently. What turned the tide here then? What caused Guiteau to think that Garfield was not the guy that should be president?
The main thing that happened was that because Charlie was so over the top, that he couldn't get anybody in the Garfield administration to give him the time of day. He had it in his mind, because he had learned French at some point, that he ought to be appointed as a consul to France from the United States, that was owed to him because he had helped get Garfield elected. He wrote letters and letters and letters to the president and his various cabinet members trying to get somebody to listen to him, and nobody would. And he just kept pushing that. And it finally got to the point where he was just, this guy isn't the right guy to be president. And
didn't he kind of worm his way into Chester Arthur? Because I saw a quote in one of these old books that said Chester Arthur had admitted that he had had meetings with Guiteau at least 20 times, or some kind of meetup with him. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Although if you believe everything, or most of the stuff that's in the TV series, most of the time when Chester Arthur met with Guiteau, he was drunk.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and so he didn't really
remember what had happened.
Didn't really know what kind of person Guiteau was, and in a sense kind of tolerated him, which made Guiteau think that he liked him and that he had an in there with this guy. And so maybe he really ought to be the one president, not Garfield. And one of the things I think that's kind of back to my armchair psychologist thing is, because of the physical beatings that I think his father imposed on him, the harsh treatment, Guiteau kind of grew up with an imperfect sense of understanding what are offenses that human beings can commit that ought to be punished by humans and what should be punished by God. And he began to think that Garfield was somebody who needed to be punished by a human, and that God wanted him to be the one to do it.
Yeah, he definitely started believing that God was telling him to kill Garfield for the good of the country.
Is it safe to say this guy was delusional or mentally unbalanced? What's the terminology that would be best applied here?
He was certifiably crazy. I mean, if you want to get right down to it.
In today's world, he probably would have been treated for some kind of mental illness. Had those opportunities been available back in the 1880s. Yeah. Interesting.
Probably today, whatever he had would be treated with drugs. And as long as he stayed on the drugs, he would have been
under control,
and been a manageable citizen. But Whether he would have stayed on the drugs is another problem.
During all of this time that he was trying to get Garfield's attention, trying to get appointed as the ambassador to France, certainly was delusional, working his con game with Chester Arthur behind the scenes and trying to get in good with him. What was his connection to Freeport? Was he staying in touch with his dad? What was happening in terms of, did he ever get back to Freeport during any of this time? Do we know? Did he visit? He talked to John Adams, but what were his connections? Pretty indirect at that point with Freeport.
He pretty much had broken away from his family. I found it very interesting. In the 1880 history of Stephenson County, they include biographies of prominent citizens, and Luther Guiteau is one of them. And in the end, he says he has 4 children. Well, at that time, he had 5 living children. Oh. So later...
Had he disowned Charles at that point?
Yes. Okay. In the trial, his son Luther, because Luther, his father dies in 1880. So fortunately, he never knew any of this.
He was dead before the assassination took place.
And so the son, Luther Jr., said that his father always thought that he would do something to humiliate the family. Oh, and the family had disowned him by that time. Okay. But there's also another thing in the trial transcripts that said he had come back to Freeport for a short period, about 3 years before the assassination, but didn't stay very long. Yeah.
And apparently during this time, he did stay in touch with his sister, Frances.
Yes, he did.
As the show suggests, that they wrote back and forth, and he was always trying to convince her that he was making it in the world, that he finally had gotten the funding he needed for his paper. It get all delusional. It was all...
the scene with the axe, though, where he wields the axe at his sister, that is true, and that is in the trial transcripts that he did that. They're trying to prove that he is insane, and actually,
yeah, no, that's fine, and it depicts that it was a scary moment, and she realized that there's something pretty wrong here, and she felt very threatened by that.
But I think she still stood behind him.
Apparently she did, according again to what we see from the Netflix show, that she did stay in touch with him, certainly. Let's talk about the event of the shooting itself. Can you talk a little bit about the events of that day and what happened and immediately before and after the shooting of Garfield by Guiteau?
Well, by the time we get to the summer of 1881, Guiteau is practically homeless. He's living on the streets in New York. He had a room that he rented, but he owed so much back rent on it, he could only sleep there at night when he snuck in past the landlord because he couldn't pay the rent. He spent most of his time hanging out in the lobbies of hotels where he'd read the newspapers and then use the hotel's free stationery to write letters to Garfield and people in his administration. And then this is when the idea begins to dawn on him that Garfield needs to be assassinated and that
Arthur to be punished for what he's not.
Right. And Arthur ought to be president. And so finally he gets to the point where God ordained this, I have to do this. And so he goes out and he borrows money, $15, and he buys a pistol. And he had to choose between one with a pearl handle and one with a wooden handle. And he decided on the pearl handle one because he thought it would look better in a museum, because he knew he was going to be famous after this happened.
Part of that vanity again that you mentioned, Sharon.
Right, exactly. And he had discovered that Garfield, the president, was going to be leaving Washington to go down to summer residence in New Jersey where his wife was recuperating from an illness, and that he would be getting on a certain train on the morning of July 2nd to go down there. And so Garfield went to the train station and waited for him. And when he came in, he shot him in the back. The first shot nicked his shoulder, but the second shot went past his spine. It hit a vertebrae, but it did not do anything to the spinal cord, and then went and lodged farther into his body.
And he was caught immediately then after the shooting.
Right, 'cause
obviously, he was
stood
in a
there.
crowd.
He had also had a cab outside waiting for him to take him to the police station.
Oh, really?
Because he was going to turn himself in. As it just happened when he turned to leave, there was a policeman there who just happened to walk in the door at the same time and nabbed him.
Mm-hmm. So again, thinking, God's telling me to do this. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to end up being famous for it and probably thanked for getting rid of this guy as president who shouldn't be president and elevating Chester Arthur into that position. And so he was not trying to get away. As a matter of fact, just the opposite.
He had actually written a book, and before he did this, he had it published, printed, whatever, because he thought, well, as soon as I am famous, my book is going to,
yeah.
And he had planned a couple of times previous to do the shooting, but each time his wife was with him, and he wouldn't shoot Garfield in front of his wife.
Oh, I see.
So there was one time, I believe, in church, and another time they were walking somewhere, and he wanted to do it then, but his wife was with him, so he postponed it till he could find Garfield alone.
So the shooting occurs, and I think the interesting part of the story is what happens to Garfield. The result of the bullet was not instant death at all. The bullet lodged in Garfield's body. And talk a little bit about what happened with Garfield and the treatment for this wound that he got after the shooting by Guiteau.
As Guiteau, lawyers are going to argue in his trial that it was not Guiteau who killed Garfield, it was his doctors, because they kept insisting they had to remove the bullet. And because of the unsanitary conditions and the way they approached things, they gave Garfield a massive infection, sepsis, and he eventually died from that. He didn't die. He could have lived the rest of his life, a long life, with that bullet in him, and it wouldn't have.
Was that right?
Yeah. It was not in a place that was going to hurt anything.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it was really, in a sense, the doctors who killed him. But of course, that was because they were trying to get that bullet out.
I suppose the thing at the time was you've got a bullet in there. It's like the old Westerns. We got to dig the bullet out. First thing you got to do. And if the doctors had known what they were doing at the time, they would have left it alone.
Right.
And there were people who were discovering this, the idea of sanitary conditions and germs, and they tried to tell the doctor not to do. There were doctors who said, don't do this. It was not long after he died that it was pretty much determined that it killed the doctors actually killed him.
Yeah. Yeah, how unfortunate. So Garfield dies, but not right away. It took several months, right? He was incapacitated, suffering from infection and in great pain at times from the sepsis that occurred in his body. He dies, and Guiteau is tried, of course, now for what's called an assassination, a shooting. Garfield dies. Talk to me a little bit about what happened as part of the trial and Guiteau's, case taken before the judge and the jury in that trial?
Well, because he had passed the bar, he announced that he was representing himself along with his brother-in-law, George Scoville, Francis's husband, and another attorney. So there were three of them. And because he was able to represent himself, he did not have to sit. He could sit at the table with the attorneys and not in the accused box or whatever that is. So that was something. And I have the closing speech. The defense submitted over 4,000 pages of information, and it was very overwhelming, and they went on and on and on. And it was the first high-profile case to try to claim temporary insanity.
Mm-hmm. And the plea did not work. It wasn't accepted. And Guiteau's attorney, he was representing himself, but not really. Ultimately, his brother-in-law.
Well, his brother-in-law really wasn't a defense attorney either. So there was this third man who pretty much took
over the case.
Yeah.
Took over the case.
Yeah.
Well, the verdict comes down, and he's found guilty and is hung as a result of the verdict of the trial. What was the Charles during the course of the trial? Did he say or make any mention of why it was that he did what he did, or did he try to justify what had happened during the course of the trial?
Well, he certainly did. As a matter of fact, part of the reason he kept either firing or had attorneys quit on him is they would say something in court and he would stand up and contradict them, trying to make his argument that God told him to do it and therefore he shouldn't be on trial, and that they ought to just give him a letter of thanks and the key to the city and send him on his way. But that caused a lot of friction with his defense lawyers. It was his brother-in-law who was the only one that really kind of stood by him in that sense. Just because nobody else would for a time, there was the only lawyer he had left.
I don't think his brother-in-law ever liked him because
No,
he lived with them on and off.
From him. Didn't he steal money from his brother-in-law?
He borrowed money, never repaid it, and stole money, and so he was constantly, and of course the trial had created this what today we would call a media circus, and Guiteau just relished that. He just loved being in front of the reporters and giving interviews, and the whole time he was in jail during the trial, and from the time the conviction was handed down until the day of his execution, he was constantly being visited by reporters who wanted inside stories and stuff, and he just loved doing that.
I think that until they were just about ready to pull the lever, I think he really thought they were going to stop it. He was going to get a pardon.
Really?
And that he was not going, it was the last couple minutes where he realized it was going to happen.
Right. He was convinced that Arthur should pardon him because Arthur wouldn't be president if it hadn't been for him.
Wow.
It'd be like
I don't
Lee
think
Harvey
Arthur wanted to be
Oswald.
president, though. So, right?
It'd be like Lee Harvey Oswald, thinking that Johnson ought to pardon me because
Wow.
That's how he got to be president.
So this is really a story about a man who had faced a lot of rejection in his life from his family, from religious communities, from friends and others who finally, could not tolerate his bizarre behavior and his con man approach to about everything that he did. And when he finally thought that he was, and rejected by Garfield's folks and his wanting to be appointed ambassador to France. But then during the trial and immediately after the shooting, he was getting all this attention, which he loved because now he was being accepted in a way. And people were coming to him and wanting information, wanting to talk to him. And he relished in that because he never really had that kind of attention before in his life. It's kind of a sad story in a way of this man.
Yeah, it is. He had a very unfortunate life. When
after he died, where was he buried?
Not in the basement of the Guiteau house. He was. Well, here's an interesting story. Do you know this, or do you want me to? Okay, he was buried in the jail yard. They did an autopsy and buried
where was
him
this
in Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. Okay,
and then there was so much rumors and things going around and threats they were afraid that someone was going to come and unbury him.
Steal his body.
Yes. And so they actually, disinterred him and sent his body to the National Museum of Health and Medicine, where they kind of dismembered him and kept parts of his body. And I don't know what happened to the rest.
Macabre.
Yeah, it was very. They bleached his skeleton, and they took his brain out and took his spleen out.
Oh my gosh!
And so it was kind of a sad he didn't even get to rest in peace, I guess.
Well, like it or not, the Charles Guiteau, James Garfield story is one that connects national and world events to Freeport in a way that wasn't always very positive or flattering, unlike some other historical events that took place that related to Freeport. But it is a story that's part of Freeport's past and part of its history, an unfortunate story, an interesting one, and kind of a sad story, too, at the same time.
Yeah, the Freeport papers went crazy. They were just, everyone in Freeport was so embarrassed to have to say that their town produced this man. And
well, he was born here, but they didn't really produce him. It was a number of different circumstances that led to that, certainly.
I don't know if you heard it or not. I heard that, and I have never found a written reference that would support it, that his sister and other relatives had decided not to have children so that the name would die with them, that they did not want the name Guiteau to be carried on because they were so embarrassed by what he had done. But like I said, I've never found anything in any book that said that actually happened.
I have not heard that either. So,
well, it's like where being buried in the basement of the Guiteau house.
Yeah,
if I had $1 for every time I'd heard that from somebody in town, and by the way, in Florida right now.
By the way, the Guiteau house was not where Charles Lynn was born. It was his uncle's house. But the house in which he was born.
So the house on Galena and High Street is called the Guiteau house. It's the old stone house. Rumors still fly that this is where Charles grew up, and it is not. This was the home of his uncle Abram and his aunt Emily Guiteau. And that is another story because Abram and his wife actually divorced around 1860, which had to be a huge scandal for the family. But anyway, Charles probably grew up in a house. In our earliest records of where Luther lived was 1861, and that was in a house on Broadway between Elk and Oak on the south side of the street. And I believe that house is still there. If you go down that street, there's kind of your typical late Victorian houses, and then there's this little tiny kind of salt box shaped house. And I'm pretty sure that that's where Luther actually grew up.
Well, I tell you, it's an interesting story.
Yeah, there's a couple other interesting connections to Freeport if you'd like to hear.
Sure.
So Horatio Burchard came to Freeport in about 1853 to be principal of a school, and it happened to be the school where Charles was attending. He quickly worked his way up through the Illinois Congress, the U.S. Congress, and at the time of the assassination, he was the director of the U.S. Mint. And there were rumors going around that Horatio Burchard had loaned Charles the money to buy the gun that he shot Garfield with. So that was a big scandal, too, for a while for Freeport. But that was proved false, fortunately. And later on, around 1880, there was an old school called Union School, not the same as the Union Street School, but there was a Union School in 1880, and this was probably when Luther Guiteau died. The school was renamed the Guiteau School, and so at the time of the assassination, Freeport actually had a school called the Guiteau School, also Charles had a half sister, Flora, and Flora was quite a bit younger than Charles. She was a school teacher. She lived her whole life in Freeport, never married. And when Charles shot Garfield, Jane Addams took Flora to Cedarville to kind of get her away from all of the talk in Freeport. And when they found out he was going to be executed, Jane Addams family took Flora to Europe, so she would be out of the country during that time. So a lot of well-known people in Freeport kind of have these little connections to the story, which is interesting.
Sharon and Ed, thank you so much for taking time with us today to talk about this historical event and how it connected to Freeport itself. We really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge and your interest in this story. And this is Alan Wenzel reminding you to tune in to our regular podcast beginning at noon on Thursdays and to listen to our extended interviews on Tuesdays at noon on your favorite podcast platforms, or you can go to our website for Freepod or WNIJ Public Radio in DeKalb. As always, thanks to the Mass Communications Department at Highland for producing these podcasts and to the many volunteers who make it happen. And thank you most of all for listening.